Let's talk about some unquestioned authority and purging the demons, witches, and Xenos respectively, with an overview of the Inquisition and their henchmen in Warhammer 40k and how they perform in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Inquisition, and this one will take a look at all the Inquisitors from the Imperial Agents index, and the positives and negatives to including them in your army list. In 10th edition 40k, Inquisitors are really quite easy to include in an army list if you'd like to. They take up the same space for Imperial Agents as things like Assassins do, and you can take one character unit per 1000 points of your army. So say for example, a 2000 point Imperial army could have up to 2 characters, whether they're Assassins or Inquisitors. Most of the Inquisitors are epic heroes, so you could only have one of each of those, and they can be a warlord if they need to be, but there's no enhancements or stratagems or anything within the Imperial Agents index, so you wouldn't be able to upgrade them further from this. These Imperial Agents are always kind of interesting in 40k, which means that if any of them are really good, then it's really relevant for a whole load of Imperial forces. Though I would say that at the moment Games Workshop has made the Inquisitors kind of well balanced. Most of them do genuinely offer interesting things that could be relevant to one faction or another, but they're all maybe a little bit on the niche side. Pretty much always going to be in solid competition with the things that are actually within each index. For the way that they commonly work, they're typically leader units that can attach to any Imperium battle line unit, or of course their own Inquisitorial Henchmen Warmans that is in this index that we'll take a look at in a second. And it's kind of interesting for the battle line squads in each army being able to access a different interesting leader and get some abilities that might not be present in the main index. The list of battle line units also includes the Vigilant Squad and the Voidsmen at Arms from the other Imperial Agents, so there could be some other choices for retinues. As well as that, most Inquisitors also have an Inquisitorial Authority type special rule where they can embark in any transport that their attached squad can. So that is kind of handy for a bunch of battle line units that they might want to join. They could be jumping in things like Chimeras or Rhinos or something for the various Imperial factions. Currently, as mentioned, I'd say that they're a little bit niche within competitive 40k. Far more people tend to take Assassins for their lone operative goodness and their fairly powerful damage dealing rules. Though I have seen a fair few lists run an Inquisitor of one sort or another if they do have a role that it fills pretty much perfectly. Let's go through each of the Inquisitors one by one then. We'll start with the named ones, then talk about the generic one, and then their henchmen. First up, we've got Lord Inquisitor Kyria Draxus, 75 points with her little dragon Shang, and she's perhaps got a fairly standard issue defensive profile, toughness 3, a 3+ save, 4 wounds and a 5+ invulnerable save. Most of the standard Inquisitors aren't really all that hard to take out. For her damage and defense to start out, she brings actually a fair amount of anti-infantry type volume fire. She's got an Eldar Shuriken catapult called Dirge Stinger. This one gets 4 attacks at strength 4, AP 0 and damage 2, but anti-infantry 4+ and devastating wounds as well. It means that you're on average to get around about either 2 or 4 mortal wounds if you do fire at infantry, and that's really not bad to add into the squad's firepower. Otherwise, she's got an attack called Psychic Tempest as well. That one's 6 attacks at strength 6, AP 0 and damage 2 with sustained hits 2, and that can fire out of line of sight if you'd like, which could be kind of fun. AP 0 does mean that they're not going to be all that effective against anything with a particularly good save, but still from her own damage output alone she averages around about 2 or 3 standard Space Marines killed in a single round of shooting at 18-inch range. She's pretty much got the potential to make back her entire points value in one round of shooting if she gets into an ideal target, which definitely isn't too bad for a character's ranged attacks. Then in combat she helps out a little, though maybe not loads, 3 attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, fairly good at killing medium infantry again. On top of that she also gets some fairly good buffs as well, +1 to hit for a unit against anything that's neither Chaos nor Imperium. That one's very matchup dependent, as it depends whether you're playing Xenos armies or not, but if you think that there's going to be loads of them out and about in the meta with things like Eldari or Genestealer cults, that's definitely an additional powerful special rule. Really helpful sometimes, but not so much in others. It would help out her own shooting attacks as well, which is kind of nice. Finally, and perhaps one of the most interesting special rules, is that her psychic power is called Psychic Veil. In your command phase, roll a dice. On a 1 you take D3 mortal wounds, but on a 2+ your unit can't be shot at greater than 18 inches away. Really quite a powerful debuff if she's in a unit that's got any sort of meaningful long-range shooting or wants to be sat on an objective and not just blown away by enemies' long-range guns. Overall, I feel like as the Inquisitors go, she's got a fair bit of good all-round threat. The Psychic Veil thing is very disruptive in the right situation for enemies trying to gun you down. The Xenos thing is situationally helpful, and I am kind of impressed by her shooting damage against infantry units. That kind of volume fire will have her pulling her weight, I think. Overall, I'd rate her as one of the better Inquisitors currently. Next up is Inquisitor Coteaz for 75 points. On the defensive, he gets a 2+ armor save, so is a little bit harder to kill than Kyria. And for his attacks, he gets a Psychic Blast. That one gets you d6 shots on the target at strength 3, AP -1 and damage 2, with devastating wounds and anti-infantry 4+. I feel like that one maybe sounds a little bit better than it is. It doesn't actually have the blast keyword. On average, you're going to be getting around about 2 mortal wounds against enemy infantry. In combat though, he is really quite punchy. 3 attacks at strength 9, AP 3 and damage 3 with his nemesis Demon Hammer. I feel like the Grey Knights are kind of envious of that. Still probably not his main purpose, but that will definitely add to the unit's offensive melee threat. Then for his buffs, perhaps the most important one is the chance to get a bit of command point generation going. Each time the opponent generates command points as part of an ability, then you roll a d6 and on a 2+ you gain 1 CP. I think that's really quite a good option. Really quite a lot of armies out there build in extra command point generation with various different characters. Against some armies that go heavy into it, you could be averaging around about 4 command points over the course of a game perhaps, if you can keep Coteaz alive of course. Definitely want to consider if you've got an army that doesn't have very easy command point generation, perhaps armies like Grey Knights for example. Otherwise, he has a bit of anti-psychic defense. You get a Feel No Pain 5+ save against psychic attacks and attacks made by demon models. Both of those are a bit on the niche side really, and very matchup dependent. If you play against Thousand Suns or Chaos Demons, it's going to be massive value. If you're not playing against one of the relevant armies though, then it's not going to be as good. Overall, again I'd say is usable though. Definitely rustling up some command points makes him well worth it if you don't have that elsewhere in the army, and otherwise I think he is good enough to carry himself for a bit of threat in his unit, with his defensive buff being situationally useful. Next up, we've got Inquisitor Greyfax, who's a bit cheaper at 65 points, and she's probably the Inquisitor that you want to have in your army if you're facing a whole load of Psykers. For her damage output, she gets Castigation and a Condemned Stake. Both of those are sniping attacks that can target characters in the unit, getting anti-character on Castigation and anti-Psyker 2+ on the Condemned thing, and she gives her unit a 4+ anti-Psyker ability as well at range as well, so Castigation will be good for that too. The Castigation shot definitely feels like it's the main one. It's strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3, and against characters and psychers you'll get 3 mortal wounds on a 4+ with those anti-keywords. It adds up to usually being around about a 50% chance for 3 damage through against most toughness 4 characters, plus maybe a bit of a chance for something with the Condemned stake, but that's really only good against psychers. Otherwise she has a little bit of strength 4, damage 2 in melee with her power sword. Otherwise, I think her buffing rules are pretty interesting for the unit. The Psyoculum gives anti-Psyker 4+ to the entire unit's ranged weapons. That's really quite an interesting one for anything that's got devastating wounds in particular. Say for example, Witch Seekers or Deathwatch veterans. You could have both of those slugging out 4+ mortal wounds against any Psyker target, making them really quite a scary little assassin unit that could hit things that are really quite big Psykers as well. Say Demon Primarchs or big Tyranid Brainbogs. It is only helpful against some armies though, again meaning that she's either better if you know that you're facing Psykers, or if there just happen to be a lot of them in the meta for good armies at the moment. Otherwise she gives the unit a 4+ leadership, which is kind of notably low. That's one of the very best in all of Warhammer 40k. Kind of weird that she somehow beats out most of the Primarchs with that. And then she's got another interesting debuff in that if a unit's in combat with something that isn't a monster or vehicle, when that unit falls back, it will need to check Desperate Escape and hopefully lose a whole bunch of models. That's definitely a powerful ability and goes very well with having her on the front line in a big scary unit. I feel like it is maybe a little bit at odds with her other abilities, which seem to be a lot more shooting focused though. Often feels like they'd like to be in a squad that isn't desperate to get into melee. Overall, definitely a lot of value here, just might be difficult to realise it all at once. As in a game without enemy psychers, she's probably not going to have all that much value, maybe a little bit on the situational side. Next, and also for 65 points, is Inquisitor Eisenhorn. He gets a 6+ Feel No Pain in addition to his standard Inquisitor profile, and he seems to be an Inquisitor a bit more skewed to just having more damage on his base attacks. Seems to add a fair bit more personal muscle than most of the Inquisitors, but doesn't really have that good buffing abilities. At range he attacks with Mind Assault, 2 attacks at Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 3, with devastating wounds and precision, and sustained hits 1. That roughly shakes out to be around about a 75% chance to get at least 1 failed save or a devastating wound on a toughness 4 character. Still not exactly guaranteed sniping, even if he does get within range with it. He also has perhaps a surprisingly potent Artificer Bolt Pistol as well, 4 attacks at Strength 4, AP 0 and Damage 2, and it doesn't actually have the pistol keyword, so that means that you can fire it at the same time as Mind Assault. Then in combat he hits with his Rune Staff and Barbarisator, 5 attacks at Strength 6, AP 2 and Damage 2, that's better than the vast majority of Inquisitors out there. Compared with his damage though, I'd say his buffs maybe aren't super exciting. He gets to buff his pet demon host Malus Codiceum with getting double attacks of both the weapon characteristics at range and melee for the demon host, which to be fair does add a fair bit more firepower and melee damage to an inquisitorial henchman unit, making him particularly good there. It does kind of make him feel like he should be an inquisitor that is used with that unit, as opposed to joining other units from other factions though. Otherwise, his second thing is a debuff to enemy infantry shooting within 12 inches in the enemy shooting phase. Most of the time it's going to amount to a -1 to hit for that unit, or on a 6 it might prevent them from shooting at all. But I feel like that one is a bit of a niche debuff, to be honest. The enemy needs to have meaningful shooting infantry within 12 inches of him and choose not to move outside of that range. And even then, most of the time, -1 to hit isn't outstanding. Overall, I think he is usable, but probably one just to add raw might to a henchman warband, and he is at least fairly cheap for doing that. I feel like he is a pretty good choice there if you want to use them. Finally, for the named Inquisitors, we've got Inquisitor Karamazov. He's the chap who stomps around on his throne of judgment with his triple-barreled multi-melter. He works very differently to the rest of the Inquisitors. He's basically an independent vehicle with toughness 8, 9 wounds, and a 4+ invulnerable save, though he doesn't get any sort of lone operative type rule, and there's no way that he can join squads. It does mean that basically the enemy can just directly shoot him with high power anti-tank weapons, which isn't exactly the greatest thing in the world. I'd say that having a 4+ invulnerable save and 9 wounds isn't terrible at 130 points, but it's not standout either, and the toughness of 8 means that plasma guns and melter guns will be far more threat to him than other enemy heavies. On the offensive, he chips in with a 3-shot multi-melter at strength 10 AP 4, damage D6, and a big melter 3. That's not too bad anti-tank firepower, though he might struggle to get it in range with only a 5-inch movement, and in combat he hits at 6 attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2 with his mastercrafted power sword. Again, it's not awful, but not really all that exciting for a slow-moving 130-point vehicle. I think his damage and defense could have been worked around though if he actually provided something pretty meaningful to the army, but unfortunately he doesn't really. He gives you a 6-inch Battleshock aura of +1 leadership, which isn't unhelpful to have in the midst of your forces, but in a lot of games it might just not be all that meaningful. And then he's got some rules to debuff enemy Battleshock, a -1 to their test aura within 6 inches of him, which I guess helps out a bit if he does get stuck into the fighting, and he also hands out a Battleshock test to an enemy unit within 12 inches, again needing to be kind of close for that despite his slow movement, and making enemies battle-shocked in your turn has kind of borderline value really. A lot of the time it just won't really matter. Overall, I'd say that having all his abilities tie into Battleshock is a bit of a letdown, and he probably does rank as the least competitive Inquisitor at the moment. You're probably just better off with heavy hitters from your own index. Finally, for the actual leaders, for a cheap 55 points, we've got the generic Inquisitor model, a toughness 3 and 4 wounds, and his main buff is to make his squad's command point stratagems a bit more efficient. Each time you target the model's unit with a stratagem, roll a d6, and on a 3+ you gain 1 CP. That is definitely useful enough, makes stratagems significantly more efficient to target his unit with, but in general I do feel like the battle line units within the various Imperial armies are generally not the ones that you necessarily want to target with stratagems all that much, and perhaps for the ones that you might be a bit more tempted to, things like Space Marines or Custodians for example, they've already got access to units like Captains that can just have the stratagem completely for free, no questions asked. I guess he is at least fairly cheap though. Otherwise you've got the choice between 2 different abilities. Either you can make him a Psyker and go for a bit more damage, or make him a non-Psyker and get some mortal wound protection. The Psyker option gives you a fairly potent flamer with the Psychic Shockwave, 2d6 auto hits at 18 inches, strength 3, AP 1, damage 1, and devastating wounds. Quite good against infantry, and on average you should average around about 1 mortal wound per activation of that. Could also help out with Overwatch if the squad that he's in has got meaningful flamethrowers. The Psychic version also comes with basically a flatly better melee weapon in the Force weapon, 4 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage D3. The non-Psyker version gives you a 5+ feel no pain type save against mortal wounds. That is quite a nice ability for big tanky battle line units that he could join. I feel like that's quite a nice one in particular for things like Deathwatch veterans or heavy intercessors. Not very relevant for Custodians as they already get it, though I suppose if and when they get extra detachments that might be a bit more relevant as they might not all be using the 4+ feel no pain type one. To have that defense though, you do basically sacrifice pretty much all of his damage threats. His melee just becomes strength 4 and damage 1, and he doesn't get the psychic shockwave, so it is a bit of a trade-off. Overall, I feel like he's usable enough for a whole load of units. He's only 55 points, and command points plus a bit of damage could definitely justify that. I still feel like for most codexes though, he's really going to struggle to compete against the standard options. I think most of the time the index-specific options for characters will tend to be a bit more useful than this. Might not be the worst thing as a budget option character for a unit though. Finally, for the forces of the Inquisition, we've got the Inquisitorial Henchmen, a really weird and flexible unit, but actually a surprisingly strong one I think. In particular for their points cost, they're just notably hard to take down. Plenty of layers of defense for how much they cost. Games Workshop gives you a fair few options for how to field them, either just 4 Inquisitorial Acolytes for a cheap 40 points, then the option to add in an extra Mystic and Gun Servitor to get up to 60, 10 Standard Acolytes for 100 points, or very big units for 10 Inquisitorial Acolytes, 2 Gun Servitors, 2 Mystics for 140 points, and at any of those squad sizes you can take an extra Jokero Weaponsmith or Demon Host. Both of those are just 10 points extra, and both I think are absolutely well worth it. Kind of crazy that you can have an enormous Inquisitorial Henchman warband if you want to, with up to 16 models if desired, and potentially for being an annoying tar pit on an objective it might not even be that bad an option. Going through the profiles, and the standard henchmen have got a fairly standard one, toughness 3 and a 5+ save like guardsmen, but all of them get 2 wounds, which does actually give you really quite a lot of wounds for the points. Particularly for enemy small arms, they're going to be a slog to chew through. You could have 32 wounds in a unit at max size. They've got a very nice damage debuff type special rule, which means that if an Inquisitor model is leading the unit, each time an attack is made against the unit, subtract 1 from the wound roll. It means that bolters will be wounding them on a 4+, and even things like las cannons on a 3+. At 10 points per model, that really is quite surprisingly tanky, and it gets better with a demon host as well. For the standard profiles, the Acolytes get some Acolyte firearms, essentially bolt pistols with an extra AP -1 at 12 inches, and then some Acolyte melee weapons where they get 3 attacks in combat at strength 3, AP 0 and damage 1. Both of those aren't nothing, but aren't really much to write home about either. One Acolyte gets a free Eviscerator, which gives them a bunch of strength 6 and damage 2 attacks in melee, and one gets a plasma pistol as well for a little bit more ranged threat. For upgrades to the units, the first small one that you can make is 20 points to get an extra Servitor and a Mystic in the unit. I say they probably wouldn't be my first upgrades before the Jokero and the Demon Host, but I feel like they had a fair bit of utility for the extra 20 points. The Servitor gets the choice of one of the 3 standard heavy weapons for them. A couple of multi-melter shots might be best. That's kind of fine for 10 points even if they do hit on 5s unless he's stationary. The Mystic gets one of the special rules where they can deny deep strike out to 12 inches. Again, a very handy thing to have parked on an objective, perhaps at the front of the squad. Means that you might be able to deny enemies dropping down to take the point and maybe charge you and get you in combat. It can be a nice counter to the things that can drop in just outside 3 inches as well, things like Genestealer, Cult or Inceptors. Then though, I'd say that easily the most valuable models in the unit would be the Jokero and Demon Host, which both seem kind of auto-include just for 10 points more. The Jokero Space Monkey Engineer gets you a 3 attacks at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2, so basically a boosted heavy bolter profile at 18-inch range, and he can move and fire on a 3+ with it. That's good value for 10 points just on its own. On top of that though, he gives the entire unit a +1 to wound at range, including him, so his attacks are going to be extra savage, and plus he'll help out the Demon Host range attacks and also the Inquisitor. That does seem like it could be genuinely quite nice on something like Eisenhorn or Kyria Draxus' ranged attacks. Then for 10 points there's the option to add in a Demon Host. He's probably even more valuable to be honest. He gives the entire unit a 5+ invulnerable save, which does make them really quite a slog to get through between the -1 to wound, 2 wounds and that. They'll be able to tank a surprising amount of enemy fire. Then at range he gets a big strength 9, AP 2 and damage 3 shot with sustained hits D3. A bit random but pretty brutal if you get that sustained hits, and also chips in with some fairly solid melee as well, 4 attacks at strength 6 and AP 2. For just 10 point upgrades, both of those add some pretty phenomenal value to the squad. I'd definitely take both of those if I was running a henchman unit. Overall, I must admit I do really quite like these guys. Perhaps one of the bigger downsides is actually having to pay for the tax for the Inquisitor to actually make them functional. Between the buffs and things though, they seem like at least a moderately dangerous unit that can handle some enemy infantry and can go up some midfield objectives. So overall, how strong are the Inquisitors at the moment in Warhammer 40k? At the moment, I would basically rate all the Inquisitors besides Karamazov as kind of niche but usable. I feel like Karamazov is just overcosted for what he does, given that those battle shock abilities aren't that impressive. Running through the list of Inquisitors, Kyria's got good shooting, a little melee, situational buffs against Xenos, but perhaps most importantly, the rule where you can't shoot the unit at greater than 18 inches. That last one in particular I think is really nice to have against enemy gun lines and makes them have to think a lot more about how they're going to deal with her squad. Coteaz has solid melee, an okay psychic attack, but perhaps most importantly the command point farming, where he gets the chance to get some command points back for you. Again, he seems pretty reasonable for that if you don't have better command point farming in your index. Eisenhorn I think is seriously worth considering if you want to make a slightly more dangerous Acolyte unit with Henchmen work. I feel like it might be quite nice with the 8-man version of the squad, 4 Acolytes, Servitor Mystic, Demon Host, and Joe Cairo. They'd have a whole bunch of shooting with +1 to wound, and at least some okay melee threat with a double attack Demon Host and Eisenhorn's contribution. Greyfax is interesting, and I feel like she has some powerful abilities for just 65 points. Definitely a bit of a situational one to include though, and it's going to be far better if you're shooting against Psychers. Could be interesting in an army where she could join things like Deathwatch Veterans or the Witch Seekers for anti-Psyker mortal wounds. The standard Inquisitor I think is a bit on the niche side, but is also the cheapest. Again, command point farming might be of interest to some armies, and a 5+ save against mortal wounds is something that not every faction has. It's perhaps a bit limited as to where you can apply those with battle line units though. And as mentioned, I feel like Karamazov just doesn't really add enough with his battle shock things. I certainly say that none of them really feel like they're auto-include or anything at the moment, not in the same way as loads of lists are running things like Calidus or Vindicare assassins. Every single army will have good leaders that will compete strongly against these guys. Depending on the mission and the matchup, sometimes the index leader will be better, sometimes you might have done absolutely amazingly with one of these Inquisitors. Otherwise, as mentioned, I feel like the Henchmen are a very interesting unit. If they are guarding an Inquisitor, they essentially amount to 16 wounds at 80 points, with -1 to wound and a 5+ invulnerable save. That's really not too bad as Warhammer 40k goes, and could be very annoying to take out for some armies. Plus they have some okay hidden damage, with Joe Cairo's giving the unit +1 to wound when shooting, and at least have enough attacks to be some worry to enemy light or medium infantry in combat. I feel like for best fits for leading them, Kyria Draxus seems quite nice, a whole bunch of shooting that can be buffed by the Joe Cairo, plus making them untargetable at 18 inches seems great. Eisenhorn seems excellent for them, just with his extra raw damage output and doubling up the Demon Host, which is perhaps the best model in the unit. Or Inquisitor Coteaz, who gets his command point farming, and they could be a good retinue for while he's doing that, plus can chip in with his own big hammer in combat, making them a bit more of a threat there. I haven't seen a whole load of competitive lists running them. I feel like they're maybe a bit out of the points range where they're going to be competing with things like Exaction Squads or Voidsmen for cheap objective grabbers, and they often tend to offer a bit more competitively, just being some very tiny expendable units that some factions don't have good access to. In a way, I feel like the Henchmen might actually be more efficient than the Inquisitors themselves to some degree. I feel like if they could just do what they did without the Inquisitor having to lead them, then they might actually be a little bit more tempting to some people. Let me know what you make of the Inquisitors in 40k 10th edition though. Have you been running any of them to good success in your armies? And we're looking forward to hearing any combos or ideas down in the comments. I'm sure I'll have missed some interesting applications here with all the Imperial armies that they've got access to. If you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. If you'd like something else similar to watch for the other Imperial Agents, feel free to check out my Assassins video. I'll link that down in the video description if you'd like to check that out next. Otherwise, if you have been finding videos like this interesting or useful, any support on the channel's Patreon page is enormously appreciated. It is what allows me to keep on doing this as my main thing and keep all the videos coming quite so regularly. If you would like to support, channel patrons do get a few advantages: seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.